Hi everybody. Over the last couple of weeks we have seen how Indigenous people see land, or country as they refer to it, and we have seen how they are able to get access to their land through legislation, things such as native title and land rights that we have already discussed. Today I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the things that are important when working with Indigenous people and working cross-culturally overall on land management projects. So the reading for this week suggests that there are 7 factors that are important when it comes to working with Indigenous people on land management projects. And these are operation of a project by a cohesive social group, Aboriginal control and commitment in decision making, access to appropriate information, acceptance by decision makers of each other's goals and responsibilities, reward for effort, compilation of management plans with realistic feasibility assessments, access to sufficient resources to carry out plans, technical support in financial and corporation management, and genuine partnerships between local people and supporting agencies. However, the reading also makes the point that even if all of these 7 factors are taken into consideration, there can still be problems. For too long now, the statements from governments about them doing this and that, and the community not using it, for example, have been accepted, despite the fact that Indigenous people and their non-Indigenous supporters have been calling for more Indigenous consultation for many, many years. For a long time now, governments and government departments have been employing external consultants and experts to develop and direct planning projects for Indigenous people and Indigenous communities. To achieve the best outcomes, it is important that Indigenous groups engage who they want to in order to provide them with the human resources they need to pursue the projects that they want to pursue. One of the things that is important when working with Indigenous people is planning. Planning is especially important in community development projects in remote areas, where people may have language barriers, low levels of Western education, and a lack of opportunity to develop a working history. There may also be issues around supplies, a lack of accommodation, all of those other things that make community development a real slog. Planning assists Indigenous people to see the bigger picture and helps them understand what they need to do to get where they want to. It allows groups to determine their priorities and to assess how they can contribute to the overall picture. This is important in terms of the cultural match that the Cornell reading referred to, as it allows different language groups to discuss issues about what non-Indigenous people may see, for example, as one area of land, without realizing that there are different groups and different countries. Then, of course, there are issues such as gender and ceremonial status. Initial planning stages can be a bit of a hurdle. However, they make sure that everybody is on the same page and that everybody is heading in the same direction. And this, of course, can prevent disagreements later. Planning also allows people to know exactly how much money they have to spend and allows them to determine the most effective way to spend this money. It also provides the opportunity to dismiss ideas that the broader group do not feel worthy of pursuing. One of the other benefits to planning is that it is a way to engage people. When people are actively engaged in a project, they are more likely to take responsibility for it and to be involved in it. The other benefit of planning is that it is often one way to help organisations attract funding. Now, this is because governments and funding agencies like to see that some work has been done, that people are taking the time and initiative to make projects work and are putting in the time to make them work. When governments see that plans are done, they are more likely to fund them. So governments want to see people put in the effort to get from A, B and C before they ask for assistance to get to D, E and F. Governments much prefer this sort of approach when people are asking for funding instead of just coming along and asking for money. Now, contrary to what a lot of people think in Australian society, Indigenous organisations and corporations, they must attract their own funding in a competitive market. They have to submit submissions for funding and they have to compete with people often all over Australia, including non-Indigenous organisations. For these reasons, it is absolutely crucial that non-Indigenous people are working in collaboration with Indigenous people on things such as funding applications and planning workshops. Without these people, Indigenous organisations and communities would struggle to attract funding for projects such as land management projects. Many of the people employed in land management in the Northern Territory are non-Indigenous people. Many of these people work closely with Indigenous people on land management. Often these non-Indigenous people are not trained as facilitators, and often the Indigenous people are not trained as facilitators either. Often they both can be familiar with governance issues. At the Central Land Council, for example, only 1/4 of the land management section are Indigenous. This is because, as I said, there will always be important roles for non-Indigenous people who are familiar with Western processes. It is difficult for Indigenous people who may not speak English, may not have good levels of literacy and numeracy, and may have low levels of education and work history to successfully manage land management projects, especially if they are not well versed in things such as financial management, funding submissions and expenditure, for example. Many Indigenous people would probably not be able to explain the processes involved in things such as project management. This is because they are Western processes and have nothing to do with Indigenous people's intelligence at all. Indeed, there are many non-Indigenous people who are also unfamiliar with these Western processes. Those working with Indigenous people as facilitators will also need to contend with these issues: low levels of literacy and numeracy, a lack of English, and low levels of Western education. Therefore, facilitators need to be patient and need to be able to work through these issues and to not let them drag the project down before it even starts. Facilitators must do their best to create a safe environment where people feel comfortable contributing, people who are already experiencing much discomfort. Facilitators need to be able to manage heated discussions while still maintaining a positive and safe environment. For example, there may be disputes about whose land it is and who has the right to contribute or to talk for country. Or there may be people who question other people's connection to a group. The Indigenous people who are typically involved in land management projects are people who believe that they have a special connection to land, that it is their country. Another problem for people working with Indigenous people on land management projects is that they are often torn between satisfying the Indigenous people they are working with and the funding providers. Often funding agencies want to be able to see tangible results from funding. They want to be able to see outcomes. They want to be able to say on their website, for example, that in 2010 they funded these projects and the outcomes were these particular things, for example. However, this does not fit well in with the long-term strategies required in remote Indigenous communities. Long-term strategies that are absolutely essential for successful community development. In remote Indigenous communities, many community development projects need to find a balance between community benefit and individual benefit. If there is no clear benefit, the community may not commit to a project, and if there is no clear individual benefit, people may not become involved. Those involved with working with Indigenous people on land management projects will need to clearly show in funding submissions that the funds they are applying are for public benefit. The language used to attract and retain and account for funding are typically complex for Indigenous people and often excludes them from the process. Typically, Indigenous communities and organisations compete with everybody else for funding. These other applicants often have Western qualifications and are able to use Western technical language and terms. One important aspect of community development is succession planning, a system where people replace other people in a smooth system, a smooth transition. Sometimes people can contribute very little and understand very little, yet will want to remain on a committee, for example, even if it makes more sense for them to make way for someone else who is familiar with Western processes. Often these individuals without this Western knowledge will want to resort to traditional methods and systems. However, due to the Western system, this often just delays progress on projects. For example, somebody at a meeting may say we should be doing things traditional way. However, the traditional way is not consistent with Western organisations and organisational structures. There are many aspects of project management that Indigenous people must be aware of if they are going to be involved in land management projects. One of these is monitoring and evaluating projects. This requires them to develop ways to monitor and evaluate the progress of projects. This may, for example, include assessing if they are on budget and assessing increases in community participation. So, for example, we had 40 people at this meeting, and at the next meeting we had 72 people. So that could be a part of the evaluation process where they say, well, look, we are attracting community members, and those members are beginning to contribute more and more, so therefore this is going well, for example. Now, this evaluation process also involves assessing if all relevant stakeholders have had the opportunity to contribute and if there would be any risks as the project develops. This evaluation process also involves assessing if all relevant stakeholders have had the opportunity to contribute and to assess the contribution they can make. An important aspect of actually measuring progress is the perspectives of the people involved. What is it that they consider progress? So this is why planning is important. It provides an opportunities for targets and goals to be set and to be met in a systemic way. Now, as we're talking about working with Indigenous people on land management projects, I want to spend a few minutes in the next audio recording talking about some of the things that are important when working cross-culturally. So please have a look at part 2.